Well, welcome to my story finding workshop here at the virtual Bend Film Festival. I love attending the Bend Film Festival when it's live, but virtual has its advantages as well. I hope that we see Michelle and Tony back on the screen here to join us for a very personal and intimate edition of the story finding workshop. I've been teaching what I've called story finding for decades now in one form or another. And it's something that I love. I grew up wanting to be a filmmaker, wanting to be a writer, director, and I pursued that. I went to school for that. And as much as I loved it on some level, I also realized that film takes time. And to realize a story could take, as you all well know, years. And I just developed a passion for the idea that helping 10, 20, 50, 100 people tell their stories better within a year was a greater use of my time than just concentrating on my own. So I'm hopeful that I can help each of you in a very direct way today. Normally, or sometimes I do this a little more presentationally, a little more lecture-y, but I already know what I think. So I'm most interested in what each of you thinks and how I can help you reach the goals that you possibly have with your work. I believe the way that it's been set up at the Bend Film Festival is that each of you actually has something in mind that you want to sort of pitch or hone in some fashion. So that's really intriguing to me. So for Matthias and Chad and Ilian and Michelle and Tony and Steve, let's have some fun and let's get into it. So is there anybody brave enough to both be on camera and share a little bit of your story and your ideas with us? Don't all raise your hand at once. Okay, Chad, it's you.
Hi, hello, my name's Chad. I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on now, trying to develop a feature screenplay for a couple, 3 or 4 years, maybe by now, 3 years. Ironically enough, the short film that I have here at Bend, I started on it because I was trying to write this feature screenplay and it just was terrible. It sucked. So I stepped away to make that other film as a creative reset. But with the success of Rat Tail and some like newfound confidence, I'm really excited to get back into this feature. It's called Wet Paint. I have a little bit of a write-up of the synopsis, I guess, as far as I see it, if that would help to read that. Maybe.
Bring it on.
Okay. Wet Paint is the story of a family who moves from Manhattan to a gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn to renovate a brownstone in hopes of turning the basement apartment into an Airbnb. The parents are making this move to enable some autonomy in their lives, giving them the opportunity to exit their soul-sucking advertising jobs to follow their own passions. The film primarily focuses on the 8-year-old daughter, Cece, who after the move no longer lives near her one and only friend. When this best friend makes a new friend in her absence, Cece feels abandoned. Meanwhile, the family struggles to get the Airbnb operational, and Cece feels lost in this new chapter in her life. Wet Paint is a film about how we are all works in progress, no matter our age, and the anxiety this creates as we struggle to come to terms with it. That's kind of the...
Well, congrats for getting through it. There you go. I have a lot of questions. And again, my hope is that even if I'm focusing on one story, that there are ideas that are applicable to everybody here. The first question I have for you, Chad, is that, that sounds like everybody in Manhattan that I know, moving to Brooklyn and trying to rent out a place. But as snarky as that may sound, I'm curious as to what makes the story different.
Right. Well, that's one thing that I was kind of battling when I was struggling with it, or like the stakes, like something that's so meant to be simple, almost like a character study. Like, how do I escalate this story? You know, I want to set it.
Let me stop you right there for a second, because here's the fascinating thing. You say it's meant to be a character study,
Right.
and I hear that, and that's a lovely thing to say. In what you read, I don't know who the focal character is.
Right.
I can guess it's CC, but you don't
Right.
start with CC.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. I think this is maybe a problem. The filmmaker in me, the one that wants to be smart about how I approach the film, struggles to focus solely on like a child, like to build the entire story around a child. I think for that reason, I've tried to not just have her be the one true leading us through this whole narrative, and tried to broaden it around the whole family. That's why, like, at the end, it talks about struggling to deal with, you know, being a work in progress is something that's applicable to all of us.
Yeah, that sounds nice, and it
Right.
may turn out to be true, but
Right.
without that specific focus on a character, like without that commitment, it's really hard to know what the story may be.
Right.
Right. So I certainly don't have a stake in which character should be the focal character, but
Right.
until you can actually go like that's the one, I get
Right.
nervous. Now there are hurdles with a kid as your focal character, undeniably.
Right.
And at the same time, coming of age stories work. Uh,
Right.
so
Right.
it's also possible that you can get away with that. The big question, and this is something I'll have for everybody, is let's just go back to why the heck you care about
Sure.
this.
Sure. Um, the initial seed for it was just thinking back on me as a child, and I mean, Cece has always kind of been the way into it for me, and her struggling to make friends, dealing with social anxiety. I dealt with that as a kid. I didn't realize that's what it was until, I mean, honestly, a couple of years ago, you know, to be completely honest. For me, the film is truly about seeing her. She has this kind of bubble between her and this best friend, and when she moves away from her, even though it's just a borough away, it kind of disrupts her whole life, and she's thrown into this new area where she needs to try to make new friends. And because she has this social anxiety, because she struggles so much at opening up to other people, she's unable to do so. And we're watching her navigate this new phase of her life, and seeing like where she finds like her safe space now. Like she gets involved, like she becomes kind of obsessed with like people on YouTube, and has these false relationships, and isn't having like a true human connection. When she does have these moments like of rekindling this relationship with her best friend, she becomes possessive because this best friend doesn't have this social anxiety and has gone on and has found new people. And Cece sees this as, being abandoned, and becomes possessive. And in doing so, in this times that she has with her best friend, she ends up like hurting the relationship, looking silly, making the best friend look, weird in front of her new friends. I feel like you're going to say something.
Yeah, I'm. Here's the thing. What's interesting, like to me, the most compelling part of that is this idea that it was only a couple of years ago that you recognized that you shared some of these values with CC, right?
Right.
And I'm not saying that all work needs to be autobiographical. Certainly not. Like nobody needs to hear our specific stories told on screen. However, like any good story carries a large chunk of our DNA in it, right?
Right.
And so there's an expression that's in so many writing books and writing classes that I think has done so much damage to people, which is write what you know, write what you know. And I think it's really comforting to people, like, well, I know things, so I can do that. And if I could share anything today, it's to eliminate that phrase, write what you know, and instead get to write what you're desperate to understand, right? So if what I'm curious about is, it took you seemingly you're over 18 now, Chad, I believe. So it took you some time to tap into that feeling and into that knowledge. And I'm curious what you are desperate to understand about your earlier life with social anxiety.
That's a good question. I'm desperate to know, like, the repercussions of it, you know, like in that time. Like, as for me as a child, like, there's a lot of, you know, shame that's built into how I carried myself at times. You know, because I was shy, there was a lot of lying that took place, which is something I feel like would be imbued in Cece. You know, like I mentioned, that idea of her finding refuge in characters like online. I see her like making to her parents, portraying these as like real people, and you know, that she's having these real life relationships. And because they're so busy trying to build this Airbnb, they don't have the time.
Don't get lost in the story over here. I okay. Really, it's going to be specific to you personally. Sure. Like going back, what are you desperate to understand? And I can break this down into two different questions for you.
Sure.
Either, what do you wish you had done differently? Like, what would you aspire to now if you could, if you could go back? Or what do you carry some sort of shame around having been like at that time?
Right. Well, you know, a lot of the shame is about the lying, about the lies were so they were big, they were involved, and a lot of them came back to bite me. You know, they came back and revealed that they were lies, and then I was stuck with more shame of having to deny the denial. You know. And that left me in a lot of uncomfortable situations with my parents. My family, for the most part, my parents were able to have social interaction, you know, at least from my point of view, especially as a kid. And a lot of that shame was built up, feeling, my sister was the same way, feeling like I'm the alien here. Like, why can't I do what they do? And because I felt like I couldn't, I would create these situations where mostly I'm going to some social gathering or something and standing off to the side and observing and, you know, participating in the way that I felt comfortable, but not doing what I felt like you were supposed to do, be like the center of the party, be social butterfly. And so I was creating these lies that were making it seem like that's what I was doing at these gatherings.
That's I'm about to say that's awesome, and I don't mean that's awesome like that you felt that way as a kid, but it's awesome for story in my mind, right? I mean, I imagine that there has to be at least one or two other people here today who've experienced the snowballing effect of lies, right? It's the problem is rarely with the first lie. It's the fact that the lie snowballs into the second lie and the one to cover that up, and then it becomes this thing because you get deeper and deeper into it, right? So that has some emotional stakes to it. And so here's a note for Chad, but it's for everybody, right? It's like when Chad was first pitching the story, it's all very plot-based, right? It was hard to tell who the focal character is. And it's all about, moving from Manhattan to Brooklyn and Airbnb and all that, like all of that is noise, right? when you start talking about, if you start talking about like Cece's a girl who deals with a lot of social anxiety, to make herself feel comfortable, she lies a lot of the time. These lies get her in trouble, especially when her parents move to Brooklyn, right? Plot just builds on character, right? Plot is there to serve the character and push them into uncomfortable places. So try to start as you can with Cece and what's going on for her, right? And so there's something that she's trying to understand in the process. And what's really helpful is to try to figure out what the aspirational part is. What does she want? What does she wish she could be? Right. How does she wish she could act? Right? And then figuring out what the roadblocks are for her. Once again, like Brooklyn, Airbnb, almost insignificant at this point in the process as far as I'm concerned. It's really about knowing who this girl is and what's at stake for her. Right. And then when you talk about emotional stuff, I mean, how many people related to anything Chad said just about being young and either being like a wallflower or being somebody who lied to try to make yourself feel better? Does anybody have that experience? I know that I didn't speak until I was 6 years old. And I, despite all the work I do now, I was a terrible introvert. So I relate tremendously to that. I didn't lie. I came up with my own coping mechanisms, but I totally get that part, right? And it was a matter of finding my way forward. And so we so often think about, that stupid Hollywood phrase of raise the stakes. And, too often that's blowing crap up, right? But the stakes really are in what we feel inside ourselves, right? The stakes can be really, really significant. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I had a number of dramatic and traumatic experiences when I was a kid. But despite all the external stuff, I can do a far greater number and worse number on myself in my head and in my heart. I don't know if anybody can relate to that, right? Like that, I know I can survive the external stuff I have, but it's the stuff that goes on in here and in here that's challenging. And those are where the stakes are for a movie.
Right.
Right. So too often we're focusing on the window dressing rather than what's actually for sale.
Sure. It's interesting because like the emotional stuff is what is important to me. When it comes to me explaining it, it's the plot that I feel like is what is necessary. And so for you to, that's a huge help in knowing like how to talk about this project in a more interesting way, pulling people in.
Well, for like, even though we're not talking about pitching per se, right? Pitching is the same thing as storytelling in my mind when it's done right. There are a lot of pitch workshops and conferences that make me want to kill myself, but mostly because they do start to like point out, oh, here's how you do it, and here's how you hit these particular plot-based notes. But to me, any good pitch starts with forming a connection with the person hearing it. That's what a story does, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you say New York to Manhattan to Brooklyn, yeah, I relate because I'm a Manhattan boy, right? At the same time, that rules a ton of people out of the story.
Right.
However, if you open it with like, do you know what it feels like to be a kid and to be on the outside? I think the numbers of people who would hear that and go like, oh yeah, including kids who probably weren't on the outside, but like to imagine they were, right? So if you start like, do you know what it's like to be a kid who feels like they're always on the outside and simply doesn't have the tools to change it? And the only tool they could find was to make shit up. And at first that seemed to be a winning strategy, but for Cece, not so much. One lie turned into a second lie, turned into a third lie, turned into a 17th lie. And all those lies would come back to haunt her, especially after her parents moved her away from New York to a place she'd never been. Despite just being a few stops away on the subway, it felt like a whole new world.
It's amazing that you
That's great.
Does that make some sense, Chad?
Yeah, no, I think that's the a big struggle for me is knowing how to talk about it, and not even just to somebody else, but even to myself, as far as like what the driving force is like when I'm sitting down and working on the page. I mean, I think that was one of the big obstacles for me when I was starting on this a couple of years ago.
It's impossible, you know. I like to think, well, we can all agree that writing is hard, creating is hard, right? It can be joyous, but it's hard on some level. Right. But to me, the hardest thing about it is that it's about recognizing what we really want to do. And I think given our different jobs and experiences and what comes at us out here in the world, it's easy to lose focus on why we're really doing it, right? And so, you know, here's a note that I'd give anybody is it seems counterintuitive, right? But the more specific we are to our emotional experience of the world, the more universal it becomes. Film has this funny way of trying to make things universal from the outset, which almost makes it bound to fail from the beginning. I don't know how many people have seen Tony's film Peekaboo. It's animated, but one of the things that's really special about it, it takes an event that was clearly in the news, although how much Americans paid attention because it was elsewhere, who knows? But it took something tragic in the news. But what was so smart about Tony's approach to it is it starts on this very personal, individual, soul level of a young character experiencing this. That follow? And so because we have this entry point, then the story is really easy to follow and the bigger stuff comes to us afterwards. Is that fair to say, Tony?
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining it this way. Thank you. Yes.
And it's a piece that I really like. And I think it's potent that way because it's so easy to talk about bigger things and have them stay academic. But the way Tony has approached this, because it's on a very singular level, brings us in emotionally from the outset. Because all I have to think is like, I don't have to think, what's it like to live in that region of the world? I don't have to think about, oh my goodness, this tragedy. All I have to think about is like, what would it be like if I were that kid in that moment experiencing this? And that's the thing that reminds us of our humanity and brings us back and makes the story universal. It doesn't matter what nationality she is. It doesn't matter where this happened. It doesn't matter what age she is. It doesn't matter whose birthday party is being celebrated. It just matters that this would suck, right? This would suck and it would do an incredible number on you. And so while the external plot-based stakes of Tony's story are very different from yours, Chad, you can still get to a similar sort of level of emotional stake in the sense of everything seems big to a kid. This is why, you know, coming of age stories works, because despite things possibly being relative as we grow older, as kids, they're not. You know, I'll often make the argument that the worst child, every kid has the worst childhood and the best childhood simultaneously, because you don't know any better. You're not really comparing notes at that point. You just know, like, today is the worst day of my life, right? And so the worst day of a kid's life is the worst day. Those stakes are just as high, right? And I think we should think about story that way too. If it's the worst day for that character, it's the worst day. You don't have to make stuff up. You just have to make it real for that individual. So, Chad, it's not like we're done, but I'm going to move around because I want to make sure that everybody's included. And then I'll probably have more thoughts about CC as we go along. Who would like to volunteer to go next?
Sure, I can.
All right.
Okay, so yeah, hey, great talk so far. It's awesome. So I created this movie, Chocolate Cake and Ice Cream. I kind of fallen in love with the character. So my idea is to pitch this as an animated series. So basically this story is about a dog who lives with its owner in a small French apartment. The owner rescues a cat that has lived as a stray its entire life, and the pets couldn't be more different. The dog is introverted, predictable, and doesn't like change. The cat is hyperactive, creative, and adventurous. Now, through numerous kind of struggles or challenges, both within the apartment as they learn to live together, and also outside the apartment where they sneak out at night to protect the stray cat community from a gang of bully feral cats, the dog and cat learn to appreciate their differences and their friendship strengthens. So each episode deals with sort of a separation, both physically or emotionally, between the two friends, and they always come back together stronger. So the idea being here is that being better together. That's kind of the theme.
Okay. Any comments from anybody out there in terms of what you just heard from Steve?
I'd watch it.
Michelle's in, boom. You've got one viewer. If you get anybody else to say they want to watch it, we've just doubled the audience. That's a good start. It's sort of it's a classic sort of odd couple setup for
exactly
for a show, right? And that can work. I think what's interesting, and even to take the many versions of the odd couple that there have been, right, is that you have these things that, again, are sort of the external things that are different about them, and that can provide some of the easy comedy of any show. But what's the greater challenge for them? What's the greater emotional challenge for them?
The greater challenge for them.
Because if they're going to learn this every episode, like,
yeah,
how dumb do you have to be to not get the lesson? When you get like, you know what, we're done with our differences, we're fine.
Yeah, I think that the friendship helps them discover, in a way, like their own little superpowers. Mm-hmm. So like the dog, for example, has this really expressive tail. He's super loyal, but he doesn't really understand how great he is, right? And the cat has its own sort of personality, unique qualities that it doesn't really understand how great it is either. And together they sort of discover how awesome they are. And that kind of plays out in their kind of adventures that they have in this little quaint European town. As they, their seemingly insignificant existence in this apartment sort of like explodes and just like enters into this town and makes a big difference in this stray cat community. Like they do a lot of good.
So again, I can see the charm of the show, and I can see, Michelle and I will sort of watch it together streaming, and we'll go to see, oh, it's great. We'll be happy watching that. But I want to get to sort of an underlying question or challenge in there for the characters. If I go to this, an interesting thing about dogs is, dogs have been domesticated by humans. There's been a lot of research lately that suggests that cats have never been domesticated, that cats chose to be domesticated. Like they're not actually, they just realize, like, if we hang around humans, we get a better deal out of this thing, right? That's the kind of thing that, while it is scientific, actually may give me something to work on in that story that gives it a little more edge. Right? The idea that, no, they're not in the same position. They have very different mindsets going in, right? They may find strength in one another, but they're very different creatures. It's not just because they're a little different superficially. At their very core, they're different. So I'll give you an example of, anybody who's been, how many people have been in a long-term relationship? Ileana, that was such a such a sighing nod. I didn't hear the sigh, but it seemed to come with it.
I'm sorry. After 31 years, you get to sigh a little bit.
So the amazing thing in the relationship is that you can love the other person, and you can even, love them for who they are, and still have tension and friction, right? Because you're just different who you are at your core. So I'll use an example from my own life, so not to pick on Ilyan or make her spill any beans here, but because well, I'm going to say this, my partner is somebody who wants things to be predictable. Let's just get things so things are comfortable, they're predictable, they're going to be the same. I don't have to worry about anything because that's the way it goes. They have a 9-to-5 job, that just like everything, it's relatively dependable, right? I grew up in chaos, and while the chaos wasn't fun growing up, I've come to sort of love chaos. And part of me loves chaos because I feel really engaged and alive when there's chaos, right? I really feel awake. You know, my Buddhist friends will tell me, like, live in the present. Like, I have no idea how to do that in terms of meditation or anything, but I know with chaos, I am actually in the moment, right? So the two of us can love one another, but that sort of core distinction creates this problem because my drive is not just that we're different on the surface, but my drive is to keep things chaotic in life, while their drive is to keep things stable. We want the best for one another, right? And we can recognize the strengths and goodness in one another, but those very ways of being are always going to create a little bit of friction, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So with the cat and the dog here, that's sort of what I'd be looking for, because those things that are part of character deep down are hard to change even if we want to, right? So I personally try to make the effort to like give over to a little more stability from time to time, and it's hard, right? No matter how much I intend to. But if I was going to do a show about that or base an animated animal on me, it would give me more territory, because now you have this thing where there are these differences. The characters can be moving to change those things, right? Trying very hard, but feeling this resistance every time, right? Because it's not their natural state. It's not their resting place.
Yep.
And so the way you're describing it, I can easily see like a season of these episodes. I get that. But what I worry about them is them feeling slight or repetitive over time. But what you can do is, if you can get to this other layer to what's going on for them, you could create this thing that actually goes back and forth episode to episode, right? Maybe at one point the dog is learning to be more like the cat, but like just can't do it. It doesn't work out, right? And the cat, and the reverse would be true, right? Maybe they can meet in the middle. Maybe it can be one of those things where they, like, maybe the dog is sort of successful in the wild, and the cat goes like, I don't even like you like that. Right? Go back to, I sort of need you being the other way you are, right?
Right.
So if you're working on a series, this sort of stuff about the internal conflict is all the more important, because otherwise the show becomes redundant really quickly. That makes some sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so, also the way you're describing that too is like you're basically delving a little more deeply into each of the characters, so they become more, they just become more real or more alive, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Chocolate Cake and Ice Cream, and it's very sweet. Like I like the film a lot, but like chocolate and cake and ice cream, if I ate them together, I would need to stay away from sugar for a little while. Like that's a little much. So you need some contrast. You need some tartness in there. You need something bitter in there. You need some cayenne pepper on the mango to like make the sweet a little more tolerable and a little more nuanced, frankly.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
I've gone nuts, apparently. So maybe we can talk about I can send you some stuff after the session, Steve, but there's something I do for a character, for any character I write about, which is called a conflict grid. And the big thing about
Can you repeat that? The what?
I call it a conflict grid.
Grid.
And so on one side, if we say there's an A side and a B side, on the A side, I'm identifying the character's habit, their regular habit or behavior. And on the B side, I'm sort of placing what the behavior or the habit they're aspiring to. That makes sense? So, you know, in the case of Chad's story, it could be Cece's behavior is to be sort of introverted, shy, a wallflower, what have you, and wants to move towards this more engaged individual. That makes sense? So those are the habits at the top level. And then the key thing for me is to understand for both sides, what is the positive emotional reward for being that way? Because if we have habits that we've kept for years, no matter whether or not they are good for us in the long run, I guarantee you we're getting something positive out of it. That makes some sense? So even the person who's shy, even the person who's sort of introverted, probably is getting something out of it, even if that's just safety. Like even if they're just terrified, there's like, if I don't engage with the world doesn't hurt me. That may be the simplest thing. But there's also going to be an emotional downside to that, right? There's going to be this emotional downside possibly of feeling, maybe it's feeling inauthentic, maybe it's feeling incomplete, maybe it's feeling feeling shame, maybe it's feeling like an outcast for not being engaged. I don't know. That's for Chad or for you to figure out with your character, right? And on the other side, you have for the character the imagined emotional reward. If I change this thing, then what? Right? If I change this thing, then how would I feel? Oh my goodness, that would be liberating. And then the most important part of any and every story in the world is what would be the last corner of the grid, which is what is their fear around making that change? So what is that thing they're terrified of? If I change this thing, what then? And so I'd argue that anybody here I imagine that everybody here on this call has had a moment in their life when they wanted to make a fairly significant change in their life. And maybe they knew it for a long time before they actually did it. And I guarantee if you could go back, you'd look at that and you could find the thing that you were terrified of, what kept you from making that change, right? So to give sort of a trite version of this, when I was working in theater in New York, I knew a lot of people who called themselves actors, right? The funny thing about them was that they didn't do much acting. They did a lot of waiting on tables. They did a lot of temp jobs, but they didn't do much acting, right? But so many of them would tell you like, ooh, once the world discovers my talent, oh, it'll be overwhelmed. I will be the greatest actor of all time. Right? They had these wonderful, grandiose visions of themselves. And I'd point out, you know, if you really want to be an actor, sending out your headshot and resume, auditioning from time to time, that would be one way to go, right? And every once in a while, people would try it, right? And then that get this emotional reward by trying. It's like, oh my God, I'm fulfilling my passion. I'm doing it. Look at me. Wow, this is great. But the fear that they had, which was legitimate, is if they start to do that, they may actually find out they're not God's gift to acting. And as long as they didn't audition, as long as they didn't actually act, they can believe that they are the greatest in the world. That makes sense? And so that fear of finding out that you're not what you think you are is what keeps a lot of people locked in where they are. And it's certainly what keeps characters locked in the first act, and what keeps them, you know, sort of struggling through the second act, because they don't want to get there, right? But somewhere in the second act, they are going to confront that thing, and it is going to suck. So for you with a series, the thing is like, you aren't going to have to get there, but you're going to touch upon it regularly.
Yeah.
Either the cat or the dog is going to be touching upon that fear almost episode to episode. So here's the distinction I'd make for you, Steve, and do with it what you will, is that very often series like this are sort of sold on the idea of like, and here's the positive takeaway from every episode. And once again, that's nice for the audience, right? But from a creator's standpoint, what matters is here's what they're possibly going to touch upon every episode. here's the fear they're going to confront nearly every episode. That makes sense?
Yes.
And so that's more a driving force to a story than we all leave happy. The driving force of the story is like, what is it that maybe over the course of this entire, not a season, but this entire series, right? What will the dog have overcome? What will the cat have overcome to recognize their own greatness and to recognize that their greatness benefits by being together? That's what I think. That's how I would try to sell that show.
That's great.
And then celebrate with chocolate cake and ice cream. If you can't get a sponsor for that show, you're doing something wrong. If Duncan Hines isn't on board, you're doing something wrong. You don't get Haagen-Dazs. Oh my God, is Matthias, are you hitting the 40 ounces right now? Is that?
No, it's mate.
Oh, okay.
No, it's late here already, and I expect it will go a little longer. So
that's fine. Steve, if you're okay, I'm going to move to whoever wants to go next. Who would like to go next?
I would go anytime. So
please.
I'll try to do that. It's a little bit complicated because I don't have like a written outline or whatever.
Okay, can I stop you there for 1 second? Which is, I'm so happy you don't have a written outline, because I was going to mention this with Steve, is that here's the funniest thing, and it has nothing to do with you, Steve. It just has to do with sort of pitching in general, and Chad did a little bit of it. It's this idea of like, we write out our stories, we write out our ideas. And it's always funny to me because in life, we don't tell stories that way. You're not at a party and you don't pull out index cards. Hold on 1 second, right? You just tell the story naturally. And everybody's pitch and everybody's story would get better if you just did it extemporaneously, right? The second you're looking at your notes, you are on some level not engaging with the producer or the audience or me or whomever it may be. So as best you can, it's not a matter of memorizing what you've written. It's a matter of absorbing what you're writing. Right? Sorry, Matthias, go ahead.
No worries. So basically, in my, it will be a feature film, and there's two characters, 1A and 1B, I would say. So one is a little bit more the main character, but there's basically those two characters are the main characters. First one is Chris. Chris is a physicist. And the whole thing sets within the realm of ambient energy pseudoscience. So there's a lot of people all over the world who try to tinker with magnets and whatever to build machines which are basically create energy out of this ambient they think they can get the energy from. So they don't think it produces the energy itself. They just think, okay, they can somehow tap into some energy which is in the room, in the ether, whatever. So there's a big community in that, and Chris is one member of this community, and he actually found a way to tap into that energy. That's the first thing. The second thing is he also did the math, and he knows that's a big problem because we have already an Earth which has a big climate problem. And if you could already now tap into like a different energy, which usually doesn't leak into the Earth, you have even more energy warming up the Earth, and then climate is even more going down the drain. So in the end, he knows, okay, it's possible. It's not a pseudoscience anymore for him. He knows that, but his goal is to prevent anyone else to find it, because that would be the demise of humanity, because he knows if many people get it, they will use the energy and then they will warm up the Earth even more. So that's the basic setup for the story. And in that, he finds himself in that kind of lorry problem, that like the train track
switch the direction.
And you have to decide this way, these few people or these many people or the dog and the little child or whatever, so that's his main conflict over the whole film. And the second person is Alex. And I'm sorry for, in my mind, the genders are not important at the moment. For me, for now, Chris is a guy and Alex is a girl. But in the end, it doesn't really matter at the moment. I find myself still stuck in this. Chris is a man and Alex is a woman because somehow it makes sense in my head. But I'm aware that this is completely interchangeable. And Alex is a sort of liaison person for a big energy company. And she's basically responsible for keeping contact with those pseudoscience guys and girls all over the world, which are, meeting on maker fairs and in the internet and on YouTube and whatever, and they're posting videos and and she's basically responsible for, okay, maybe if someone gets close to a solution, we as the energy company X, of course, want to get this person so that we get the invention, basically. So she's basically, she knows all the big players in that pseudoscience community. And of course, she at one point also knows about Chris and gets to know Chris. And the conflict starts when there is one person which she thinks is very close to a solution, and this person dies an unnatural death. And also an interesting information in this ambient energy pseudoscience subculture, there's a lot of people who think, oh no, it's really like, actually there's a solution, but always when someone's getting close, they're getting killed by big energy or whatever, so this is I don't know the English word for it. It's like a paranoid. They're very paranoid. It's a very paranoid guy. So within each other, they are talking, but like from outside, they're trying to shut out. So that's the setup. She discovers, oh, this other guy who was very close dies of an unnatural death. And she starts to be like a sort of detective to see how that came to be. And in the end, she comes to the point where she realizes, okay, Chris did it, because Chris, usually his way to prevent people from finding the device, from finding is, infiltrate the group, they are working together, and then, just doing little changes in the devices so that they won't work if the groups are working in the right direction. So he tries to do this non-destructively, basically, just to destroying the machines or the concepts and, miscalculating stuff and whatever. But at one point it goes wrong and he gets caught, and then in the situation, he just kills the other guy. So he has the big problem now. He killed this guy, but it's exactly the lorry problem. Either this guy actually, takes out the invention to the world, or he just dies, and then only he dies and not the whole of humanity. So there's, this detective role of Alex, but with the background of the big company, which everybody in this pseudoscience community thinks, oh, the big energy company is the bad guys, but actually she is basically acting as a good guy because she wants to find the guy who's actually killing off those guys. And this guy also is a good guy because he does it for a good reason, but basically both are doing good and bad at the same time. It's hard to tell it not in my mother tongue, but I think you get the idea. And in the end, there is a showdown, and I'm still undecided if actually they start working together because she gets convinced by him, or if he kills himself off to not give the solution to anybody, but then she continues his work because she in the end understands him. But the idea is, in the end, because of her and because of him before and because he convinced her, actually big energy is then doing these things, but for a completely different reason, basically. So that's all I have.
Okay, well, I have some questions.
So.
I have questions. I'm going to ask for some comments in a second. And if we had more time, I'd ask you to say it again in Deine Muttersprache. But Michelle, what is your take on this? What's your just sort of reflexive response to what you heard?
Honestly, I had a little hard time following.
Okay. All right. Anybody else can give me just an immediate response? Tony?
I kind of felt like it was similar to other stories where people were like seeking immortality, and it always ends up like being self-destructive. And in a way that I kind of got that, and I kind of like that idea. They're trying to get this energy source, but it backfires.
Okay. Tony, you were going to say something as well?
Yes, I was saying that, so we have 3 characters, because I thought we have 2 characters, and then he told me there's a 3rd character also.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the other guys who's inventing. I mean, there's a lot of characters in the end in the film, but there's Chris and Alex, the 2 main people, and of course the guy who gets killed, and other people who also are in as side characters, but not as the main people who are really yet in the spotlight. And
for me, it's a bit confusing, but I'm sure because the plot is a bit complex. So I'm sure maybe if we hear it maybe a second time, not now, but when watching the film, it will be clear maybe.
Yeah, I think so. What we're hearing, especially from Michelle and Tony, right, is that there's some confusion around the plot, and I don't think it's a language thing. I think it's hard to follow because our brains don't follow information naturally as story, right? In my mind, plot is really overrated, and it's not critiquing your plot whatsoever. It's just that we simply don't care, right? Not about your story, but in general, we don't care about plot as much as we are led to believe. And, you know, when you were talking, there was a point where I was like, I'm going to start taking notes because I just want to make sure I track this properly. And again, that's where we run into trouble, right? Because if I'm thinking that way, again, I'm not engaging with it fully emotionally. So to me, the facts don't matter. And I'm not talking about American politics where seemingly they don't matter either, but the facts don't matter in terms of story, because if we're into it, we'll follow along, right? We just need a little bit. If you told me there's an alternate energy source out there, a couple people have inside track on the answer. One has the inside track on the answer, and the other one is desperately trying to find it. That's probably all I need to know about the energy thing, right? Like the details of the energy don't matter at all. What matters is why these 2 people are driven to do this thing, right? And I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, that, is it Chris, right? Is the main guy?
Yeah.
That Chris is essentially the focal character of the piece, that he's the one who's really driving the story. Is that fair to say?
No, I think they're quite leveled in the end, because Chris, of course, is the key to this energy source, and Chris is, of course, through his actions starting all of it. But I think equally important is Alex, because with Alex we are understanding more of Chris. in the beginning, we don't really know anything about Chris. And through Alex's research, we get to know it better, you know, and then we slowly understand his character better through her research and through her detective work kind of thing.
So let me try it this way. So earlier I said this thing like, don't write what you know, write what you're desperate to understand, right? I think this is the write what you're desperate to understand is the core for every character. And there's a way that I have of tapping into this, because what's interesting about what you're setting up here is that Chris is responding to the situation in a way that not everybody would. Is that fair to say? Because clearly yes. There are other people who are absolutely positively ready to exploit this information.
Yes.
Right? So yeah. Something sets Chris apart.
Yeah.
Right? And something sets Alex apart as well.
Yes.
Right? That they have drives to do what they're doing that are stronger than most other people's drives.
Yes.
Is that fair to say? And that distinguish them from others. Yeah. So I need, if I'm going to tell a story, I need to put I need to define that thing, what separates them. And so I start a story by figuring out what am I desperate to understand. And then when I have an idea for my focal character, I try to identify what their nugget is. And I'm about to put them up a list of possibilities in the chat, but I'm going to try to explain it first. That there's a core sort of emotional question for your character, right? There's something that's driving them, that's compelling them to do what they do. There's got to be something there's got to be something emotionally at stake for Chris that makes him act differently than most others. Why is it, not just academically or intellectually, why is it emotionally he feels so invested in protecting the world from this?
Good question. Emotionally. Because he can't understand that nobody else is academically able to understand this. It is completely academically driven. That's his character. He is just, he sees the alternative energy source, which pulls energy from another dimension, whatever, yeah, will be the demise of the world. And nobody understands, and everybody seeks to get it, but nobody gets it.
Right, but we could make, and I get that, like, that initially drives him, but like that doesn't seem to be the core of the story. The core of the story seems to be that he's going to give everything he has to make sure that nobody else gets it. Right? He may have started with the academic drive to understand the energy source, but it's something else that's in play to save the world. Because look, I don't want to get into anything too political, but we could argue that mankind has a pretty good idea of what's harming, say, the environment right now, right? With really little effort to do a damn thing about it.
Exactly. That's the motive which is behind the movie as well. So
what is
that
is
what
special ingredient
is standing for?
What's that special ingredient? Because clearly many people don't have it. I'll take an answer from anybody.
I can't say. I don't know.
So I'm going to start putting these. It's going to take 2 chunks of these possible, what I call nuggets, in the chat. And what I'm suggesting is that your character, and it's for any character that is leading a story, and it could be the dog and the cat, it could be Cece, it could be Chris, it could be Alex, has one of these nuggets. If you have 2 equal characters in a story, I'm not going to get into that debate, but you know, for Steve, I'd say like the cat and the dog probably share a nugget. They may be in different places dealing with it, but they probably share one. I bet Chris and Alex have one as well, that they're sharing. And that's the thing that's interesting, because again, we have this real world example of what makes, once I wouldn't write a story about her necessarily, but what makes Greta Thunberg who she is? There's something going on for that kid. And it's easy for, you know, critics to say she's spectral, but or on the spectrum, but I'd say that there's something else going on there, right? So to me, I'm always looking to write about characters who stand out a little bit, right? It'd be easy to say that Cece and Chad's story is sort of an outcast, and at the same time, Cece stands out for being different the way she is, right? You want a character that distinguishes themselves in some way, right? And so I have to believe that one of these things is at stake for the character of Chris, at least. Otherwise, he wouldn't try that hard. He's trying to prove something. I would suggest that Chris is trying to prove something to himself through doing this, whether he's conscious of it or not.
What
was that?
Really quick, Steve made I thought a really good point about there kind of being a God complex. Is that what you're saying, Steve?
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're getting at here, Warren? Like, could that be one of these nuggets, essentially?
It could be. Yeah. Absolutely. I think there is, Am I God is on there. Right? That could be it. I mean, again, the best way I know to talk about stuff like this is just go to whatever's personal. So I know for myself that my nugget, you know, in my life and in the majority of my stories, because I think when you find a nugget, it's a reflection on you. If your stories are good, they're generally a reflection of some part of you. And very often we write similar stories over and over again. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's just like we're exploring the same turf. You could make an argument that Martin Scorsese, in essentially every one of his films, has been dealing with the question, the nugget, am I redeemable? Whether it was Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, or Rupert Pupkin in King of Comedy, whether it was Leo DiCaprio in Shutter Island, whether it was Christ himself in Last Temptation of Christ, all these characters are on some level are dealing with this idea of redeemability. Is there anything I can do to prove myself and make myself redeemable? That's not coincidental. That's clearly the reflection of a guy who is a lapsed Catholic and trying to work through this thing and his own doubts about his life, right? So if I'm going to work on a story and I go to my personal stuff, I know that my nugget, which has driven anything I've written with any sort of commercial or critical success, is, am I significant? And it's a thing, it's not about what other people think of me, it's what I think of myself, right? If I'm doing anything, contributing anything. And then when I'm in a situation where I don't feel like I'm contributing, I get sad really quickly. and I want to get the hell out of it. If I don't feel like I'm being of benefit, I'm pretty depressed. If that makes sense. And so I'll do things, you know, superficially somebody could go like, oh, that's a really good thing for you to do. It's like, no, it's not. It's not that I'm doing it because it's a good thing to do. It's because I feel compelled to do it. I could barely not do that thing. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about a story, Matthias, with like really high stakes, like, you know, in the lorry problem, or, you know, Americans, I think, call it the trolley problem, in that the stakes are really high for him to constantly put your life on the line and to potentially kill others, to save others. On one hand, like the sort of like flat writer's way to approach it is, oh, he's a really noble character. Oh, screw the nobility. It's like, why is he actually driven that way? And so if you can figure out this thing, you know, whether it's significant or worthy or patriotic on there, or, you know, redeemable, like, what is it for Chris that he's trying to prove, even unconsciously, to himself by doing this? That's the question I'm looking for, because otherwise you get into a weird thing in stories like that where it becomes, the storytelling becomes very logical and linear. And as much as logical and linear sound good, they often lead to sort of flat storytelling, because we don't need to go A to B to C to D to E. We actually jump around. when you hear people tell stories in real life, they don't follow that clean a chronological trajectory. They start here, they jump somewhere in the past, they come back to the present, maybe they jump into the future, and then they continue along where we're back in the present, whatever it is, because they're really trying to explain something and explore something in the process. So Chris is really interesting, and what would be fascinating over the course of this film is to see how he got there, right? Not just what he's doing, but how he got there, what made him that. I'm going to reference a way too old movie, but I'm hoping that a couple people have seen it. Has anybody seen The Conversation with Gene Hackman, old Francis Ford Coppola film? Anybody? Just
long ago,
yeah. I mean, I'm not saying it's a perfect movie, but it's a wonderful movie in the sense of looking at this idea of a nugget, or looking what drives somebody. If you go back and watch that, Gene Hackman is a surveillance expert, and he's tracking this couple. He never does anything to intervene, but for whatever reason, this time feels compelled to intervene, right? And 2/3 of the way through the movie, I'm not going to spoil anything, there's a story told without his really wanting to tell it that reveals his past. And then you go like, of course, that's why he's acting the way he does, right? It's not just out of the goodness of his heart. It's not just because it's the right thing to do. It's because this individual is carrying this much guilt around this other thing, right? And so I think that you start to see that, and then the character makes sense. Mm-hmm. So in short, Matthias, what I'm trying to say is that, to me, the hurdle that you have to get over in telling the story, is selling the story, is that Chris is currently in this telling is two-dimensional, because I admire that he's doing the right thing, but I have no idea why he's doing it, right? And so that puts a lot of pressure in being clever in the script, rather than just knowing like, oh my God, this guy is driven because of blank. Alex is driven to track this down because of blank. Those are the things that really are going to make the story pop eventually. Otherwise, it becomes sort of, once again, I'm not saying this is the way it would be, but it risks being generic, right? It risks being something with the third Hemsworth brother. I don't know. There's Chris Liam and poor schmuck Hemsworth, but that one, right? It's like, all right. That's what you're trying to avoid, is how do we get to something where the character actually feels fully fleshed out in some way? So to me, I would take your pitch and like I would trim about 2/3 of it off and just start with, Chris is a guy, like, you know, have you ever felt like others were depending on you and you couldn't let them down because you've done it in the past and you'd do anything to make sure it was right this time? Well, Chris now has the weight of the world on his shoulders. When there's an alternate energy discovered only because he's one of the few people capable of doing it, he recognizes that actually the fate of the entire planet is on his shoulders. And this time he's not going to let them down. But in order to do so, he's going to have to betray everything he believes in terms of being good by making choices about who gets to live and who gets to die. Better-ish?
Good.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, I'm never trying to critique anybody's story. I'm just trying to get to like how to lead into it.
Totally. The only question I'm asking myself is, what could he have lived through in his life prior to that, which is comparable to humanity getting wiped out? And he was responsible for it. Of course, it's like you have to scale it, and maybe it's something little in his childhood or whatever, but still, that was like the first thing I thought of now, that he would, whatever, like it was clear that something would happen, but he didn't intervene, and then his cat died or whatever. But
it could be literal, right? Or it could be simply, I mean, this is true in science. Robert Oppenheimer, developed the atom bomb and lived with a lot after the fact. Like if you're a scientist, I bet you're aware of that. right? Like maybe this is a guy who studied that. Maybe this is a guy who like knows all the people who have created things only to see others suffer as a result of it.
Okay.
Right? Maybe he's obsessed with that. Like, like that'll do it. I mean, I am not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but the Oppenheimer story is one that would give me great pause at all times. I mean, or just the fact that humans have proven time and time again that anytime we try to play God, it generally works out poorly.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you haven't seen it, there's a documentary, Darwin's Nightmare, which
sure.
is arguably one of the most depressing things ever, but such a wonderful testament to man's ignorance. So,
because Hubert Sauper, he's from Vienna too.
He is?
Yeah.
Oh.
He lives here.
Oh, I really like that. I like that film because it to me, it lets the story play out without commentary. It's just like, look at the ripple effect of this bad choice.
Yeah.
Which was intended to be a good choice. Whoops. So I think that Chris doesn't necessarily have to have done something, risk the life of his pet or anything like that. But he does need to have this ingrained sense of what can go wrong with knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So even if I go to a question like, I don't know if it's, let's see if it's on there. Amazingly, it's not. Like, am I wise, right? Like, this is an interesting question, or am I smart? Like, here's a guy who's based his life on trying to figure out this thing. And he's got to have this awesome moment where like, yeah, nailed it. I figured out that thing. I made it legit that nobody else could figure out. And the instinct would probably be like, I can't wait to tell the rest of the world about this because I'm that friggin' smart. However, if I tell the world how friggin' smart I am and how I figured this thing out, I risk there being nobody here to actually remember my name. So what does he do with that conflict?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, but that's not his conflict. He doesn't care about his name. But I get what you're saying, and I think this is more of, I think I could think more of a situation in his prior life, basically, before he did that. More of a thing where he knew something,
right,
but he didn't intervene because he didn't trust in himself. And then it happened. And because of that, he started to trust in his own knowledge and discoveries. And that is more his drive. But I understand what you mean. I think I get the idea.
Yeah, and that's all I'm hoping for. Is like I can't, you're going to know which one is right for you.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of finding it. And again, I would highly encourage you, whenever coming to problems and hurdles with your storytelling, just go back to the thing that's right for you, right? Just go back to the thing that's true emotionally for you. What would be at stake? To me, even as I said, like if my nugget is, am I significant? I know how I would take the story of Chris instantly, because that's the thing I'd play with, is his sense of significance in there, right? It's like, oh, it could feel incredibly significant if like, I've discovered this new thing. That's pretty significant. And at the same time, now is this weight of like, I could be really significant by saving the world, by not allowing this technology to get out there.
Yeah.
However, in doing so, I risk that by tearing down everything else I believe in.
Yeah.
That's a lot. So I'm into this. I want to watch this movie. I just want to understand Chris better, and Alex better too. So thank you, Matthias.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Oh, Michelle, it looks like you're about to jump in there.
I'll jump in. Yeah. So this is a very new idea. So it has some fleshing out to do. So I used to work at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and this is more on a documentary angle. And I also have this really my father helped me build this film business or video company, and always had a really close relationship with my dad growing up, and so what a lot of people don't know is that David Packard and family of Hewlett Packard built the aquarium, and over time Julie took it over, and definitely had enough money to just not work, and decided to take it on. And while I worked there, I went through all their footage for a different reason and just saw so many. I could really see that her and her father built this aquarium, and I know her sister was involved too, but he like invented this way to keep the kelp, and they really were like this just sort of family effort to bring ocean conservation to the community, turn this wharf and old wharf, and but there's also some other so I think that's an interesting story there. I'd have to dive deeper to see where there's pitfalls or sort of different parts. One thing I did see while I was there was that while they really tout ocean conservation and sort of create this fish wash, they also were kind of in conflict with, they had to work with fishermen to feed their creatures, so they couldn't really speak out against them, because they also needed them. And then they also take a lot of critters from the ocean that die, more quickly because of being in the aquarium and so forth. So I don't know, not really related, but yeah. So I mean, I just David Packard is just he's the founder of Silicon Valley, but this sort of personal relationship I thought would be pretty interesting to dive into. So again, it's a pretty fresh idea, but.
Well, I think there's something there, right? And fresh ideas, I mean, this is a great time to be talking about them so they can start to find things. The big distinction I always make for myself is between interesting and compelling, right? I'm sort of naturally curious, so I find many things interesting. And when people approach me about producing like docs, because I love docs in particular, I'm initially a sucker because everything's interesting to me. But it's getting past that first hurdle of interesting to the compelling part, right? What actually makes it a compelling part? Like hearing about Packard it's interesting to me. It's not compelling. The second half of what you're saying became more compelling to me because there was conflict in it, right? There's this interesting thing about there is a mission that they have, right? Which is to educate and preserve and advocate, correct?
Right, yep.
And yet at the same time, some of their very actions are counter to that mission.
Correct, yeah. In fact, while I was there, yeah, I saw a few go down, yes.
So that to me is the compelling part of the story, right? Because, and I'm not blaming them at all, because I think, most of us run into that problem. The thing that you're trying to save, you may actually be hurting in the process, right? It's like, Al Gore jetting around the world while talking about climate change and contributing tons of greenhouse gases, right? Like, I'm not critiquing in the least bit. It's just one of those, interesting, it's not even a hypocrisy or a double standard. It's just the challenge. Like nothing is perfectly clean. So to me, what I would look for in a doc about that is, both in the family history and also moving forward is investigating that friction between what we want to do and what we have to do to get there. In fact, it's a little bit like, because that's in every story. That's in Matthias's story about Chris, right? It's like, this is what I want, and this is the problem because this is what I have to surrender in the process, right? The lorry problem or the trolley problem is the problem that it is because either way requires sacrifice, right? Someone's going to pay for the choice. So, whether or not they want to, they are making decisions that have impact And it's not just the stuff that goes in the brochure. It's not just the positive stuff that goes in the brochure.
Right.
And so to me, the interesting thing is that, and not for your piece, but like with documentaries in general, when they're focused on an individual or an organization, is that they tend to fall to one end of the spectrum or the other, like puff piece or, takedown. And what's interesting to me is that there are not enough documentaries that actually explore the middle ground. Like, it's not a puff piece, it's not a takedown, it's actually looking at, this is hard. This work is hard. And there are some things that, we don't love about this gig, but sort of have to happen. I personally, I love animals, and I feel torn every time and it's been a long time that I've gone to a zoo. Like I can't stand seeing the regal animals in cages, and at the same time, I feel so lucky to be able to see them because I wouldn't otherwise. I also recognize that maybe it's great that other generations or future generations get to see those animals, and at the same time go like, it's pretty brutal. There's this thing at the National Zoo in DC right now had like a cheetah just had 5 cubs, and they have a cheetah cam, and so I can't help myself, I got to check in on the cheetah cam. They're cute, they're adorable. And then I like, as much as I mean, oh, look at the little belly, it's great. Then comes the moment where I recognize how small the pen is that the mother and the cubs are in, and go like, oh my God, this is a nightmare, right? Like I'm so fortunate to see this precious moment or these precious moments, and I also feel terrible. Like, what are we doing to this animal? That's the scope of its life. So again, I look for those things not to take anyone down, right? But just to like show how hard these choices are for an organization. That make some sense?
Yeah, I mean, do you think that, I feel like a takedown is what is compelling and talk and sort of creates chatter, right? And so I'm curious if it doesn't go to that extreme, will it really grab attention? I mean, I don't know if you saw Becoming Cousteau, but I thought it did an interesting balance on his story of some of the good things he did and some of the impacts he had as well. So yeah, just curious if you think that would still be enough.
I think that's a great question. I mean, there's no doubt that you're right, that the more direct takedown route is a thing that generates more PR in the short run, right?
Yeah.
Because it gets people riled up. What did we learn about Facebook at the congressional hearings? That like anger triggers people to click on stuff, right? So yeah, the takedowns work clearly on some level. I don't know that they last though. I think it's a diminishing returns thing. It's like you get that initial pop, and then I think the pieces go away. And I question how sustainable they are, right? Like I saw The Cove, and it's a very well executed documentary. Anybody else see that, the Luis Ahoyas thing about dolphin killing in Japan? Like, and I was, where can I click on something to sign? What can I do? And the thing is, outrage has a very, very short lifespan. You can't maintain that. And I think the movies that are takedowns all are fueled by that outrage. But if you have a movie that's a little more even-handed, it's not because you're being nice, but because it's probably more sustainable in the long run. Like, let's look at these questions and challenges, right? And that's going to last a long time because those questions aren't going away.
Yeah. I mean, that describes, I think, an inner conflict a lot of people have who want to do good, but they know that they are flying on jets, and that it's just like, it is that sort of constant inner conflict that how do I do good, but know that I'm also functioning in society and not a hermit out in the boondocks and like not seeing anybody and living off the land. And yeah, that's an interesting dilemma.
You know, you can talk about you know, Americans being polarized, right? But I think a lot of that starts not with the politics, but with our storytelling in general. Our storytelling has a tendency to be very black and white, right? Because it's easy, it's simpler, right? But as storytellers, I think our responsibility is to bring the gray back into story. And I think especially in documentaries, it's really important to bring the gray back into that, because that's how we return to that idea, right? Polarized stories are initially compelling and can drive PR and marketing and buzz. But again, I don't think they work in the long run. So there's, you know, Shekhar Kapoor said, I can only paraphrase, but I love this idea that Western storytelling is obsessed with resolution, and Eastern storytelling, which is the side I'd be on, is interested in finding harmony. Right. So Western storytelling, I think, is very interested, and that's why we get the polarized, you know, either puff piece or takedown, is because we want Americans in particular want the answers to be simple. I can love this thing or I should hate this thing. Tell me which it is. Right. But the intriguing thing, and even in the story that you're telling, is really trying to find the harmony of that. How do we find the harmony of serving as an educational space for people, caring for fish, while recognizing that we are probably shortening the lifespans of those creatures we're taking in, and, you know, depleting other resources that may be needed to support the very thing we're advocating for.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And so that to me is like, that's a really that moves from interesting to compelling.
Yeah.
Is how does this aquarium both meet its mission while somehow learning to recognize, live with, and ideally slowly minimize its impact on the very ecosystem it's trying desperately to protect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they had a great white shark, and they lost a few in the early experiences, but you know, it was a huge attraction, brought lots of people, and there's quite a few examples of that. So, all right, I'll push into that. Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, to me, it's always that if you go with the gray, right, you may not get the initial punch or the initial buzz that some other pieces will, but I think the film sticks around because those questions aren't going away, right? So, you know, the Cove was all focused on what happened in Taiji, just like Blackfish was all focused on, you know, SeaWorld, essentially. But the very questions raised in both those documentaries exist today, but we're not talking about them because, you know, one side in each of those stories was so demonized that there's no place to have that conversation anymore. Mm-hmm. So for me, as storytellers, we make a mistake of wanting to deliver our story to the people who understand it most, when our goal needs to be to tell our story to the people who don't get it, right? And I'm not talking about just about documentaries. I'm talking about Chad's piece with Cece, right? I bet there are, you know, a lot of people who've had the experience that Cece has had, and when they see the movie, they're going to go, "Oh my, the kindred spirit." But what's going to be really interesting is for those who had to live with somebody like Cece, if Chad tells the story the right way, it's going to be this wonderful thing. It's like, now I finally get them. Now I finally understand, rather than just being pissed at them for lying to me, or being like thinking like, what a weirdo for being like that sort of, you know, reclusive or shy, whatever. Now I understand them, and I'm going to treat that person in my life better than I did before. So too many stories start with this idea of like, let's just, you know, sort of celebrate the thing we already know. When it's like, no, you know, not only when I start a story am I desperate to understand something, I'm desperate to communicate my experience to somebody else. when I said earlier that I didn't speak until I was 6 years old, when my first grade teacher is really the first adult who got me to speak. And when she did, one of the first things she said is like, why haven't you spoken until now? And I said, because I didn't think anybody would listen. And I think a lot of people feel that way in different ways at different times, right? Is anybody actually listening? So our job as storytellers is to tell the story in such a way that people do listen, right? But I know that if you just tear something down, you're just getting the people to listen who already want to tear it down. When really what you need to do is get the people who want to support the thing to question what they're doing. That's the challenge of the story.
Right.
But I'm into this doc. I want to see it. I want to see it.
Yeah. We'll have to see if they'll let me in again.
Yes. Don't tell them it's a takedown.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
It's been great. Yeah.
Thank you. Tony or Ilyan, who?
I can jump in, or Tony, whatever. I'll go.
Yes.
First of all, I want to say that this last thing that you said is extremely valuable, and I totally agree with it. It seems simple, but it's the whole conversation has been very, very fruitful. So much so that I have two pieces now that I'm going back and forth, and I don't know which one I want to talk about. I might be the odd duck out, but I'm not a filmmaker. I'm more of a writer, novelist. So this is for a book. Not that I'd be, against it eventually being picked up for a movie one day.
Any of you can option it if you like it after hearing this. Go ahead.
So there's two pieces, like I said. One of them that has been a work in progress that I've started and I kind of stalled because of life. And then the other one is a work that has been, the characters have been sitting in my brain for a very long time and they're screaming to come out. And it's something that I'm really feeling like I'm very close to just put to page. Both stories are character driven, and in being one of the last ones to go through, I've already started thinking about a lot of the things that you've said as to those pieces.
So let me ask you this so we can focus on one of them. It sounds like the latter is one that is screaming to get out, so you sound fairly confident. The first one though, right, that you said you stalled on, you still want to write.
Yes.
Let's talk about that one, because here's the interest, like, if we can figure out why you stalled, my belief is that writers run into the same roadblock on every single project, like at the same point in the story. So if we can identify what that obstacle is, maybe it'll be helpful for whatever you work on. So let's talk about the stalled one.
Okay. So the stalled one is a story about a woman that receives a letter. She's, I think, celebrating her 30th birthday or something like that. And she receives a letter in the mail that she doesn't know who it came from, that basically flips her world upside down. And she discovers, or she thinks she understands from the letter, that her mom, or whoever she thought up until her 30s was her mom, is not her mom, is not her biological mom. And her aunt, which she's amazingly close with, is actually her mom. And so, and therefore the dad is not the dad, and the dad is not in the picture. And it's kind of a story of a whodunit, because throughout the piece, you kind of discover about these characters, everybody has a motive to have sent her the letter. Even though it's this big secret, everybody has a motive. And so as you read it as the reader, and as you move through the piece, you're basically seeing, you're constantly going, oh, I think, it's the dad, not the biological dad. I think it's the dad because of this and this and this that sent her the letter. Oh, I think it's the mom that actually sent it because she wanted to reveal the truth, because so this is where I don't know where I'm going with this. Either the mom has died and she left that to her because she finally wants to take that burden off of her and tell her who her real mom is, or, you know, the mom has some other motive. So I have all these motives, or it's a biological dad. So the biological dad has, this has been a case of like a very early teen pregnancy for the aunt, which is not the aunt, which is the mom. And then her sister, which is a lot older than her, takes the child on. And the biological dad is a mess, or, you know, he's either in and out of drugs, and he's getting to a big birthday, maybe his 50th or something like that. And he's finally clean, and he wants to get his life back together and do amends. And so he finds her and wants to contact her and tell her. So we don't know throughout the story why, but basically the real question, or the motive of the story, is this woman that finds out that her world has been flipped upside down is having an identity crisis, but she needs to figure out, am I who I am because of me, my innate characters, and I would have always turned out that way? Or am I who I am because of my environment and where I grew up and how I grew up? And therefore, since the rug has been pulled from under me, now I have to question my whole identity and who I am. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I see, so here, you know, again, this thing that we run into is like, you know, the letter flipped her life upside down, and you sort of flipped the story upside down in terms of, and you're telling of it, the MacGuffin, which is the letter, takes the precedent in your storytelling over the woman, right? And we only start to hear about the woman in the second half of what you're telling me. Like, right. To me, I can't, like, there's so many possibilities, and I can be like a game of Clue or something like, yeah, I could be invested in finding out who who delivered the letter. But if I don't care about her,
you don't care about the
outcome of the letter is inconsequential.
Right.
Right. So the risk here is, I don't know that you've put enough into why it's significant for her. Yeah, I'm sure that would be disarming at the very least for anyone who got that information. Oh, my parents are my parents. That's a lot, right? But what makes her different, right? And the question of, you know, is it nature or nurture? That's sort of an academic question rather than a personal, individual, emotional question. So again, I'm always going to try to get down to the individual emotional thing. I mean, people do deal with that. Adopted people deal with that constantly. Like, you know, is it about my genetics? Do I need to go find my biological parents, or are my adoptive parents, you know, enough of an explanation? I think that's going to prove to be a dead end, and that would certainly stall me out in writing,
right?
Because I would not have a real drive to figure out this character, right? Again, the reason for that idea of like, don't write what you know, write what you're desperate to understand. I imagine that everybody here, when they've created something, has run into the place where you've stopped. Has everybody like started something and not completed it? And to me, you know, writing is hard, creating is hard, but a big part of it is that I need to be invested in it. And if I'm not invested in it, I'm not going to do the work, right? And so if I just put myself in your place with that story, it's like, I'm not invested in her at all yet. And so I would have no reason to get up other than to like prove to myself, I've got a really clever puzzle here that I'm going to try to solve for people in a satisfactory manner. And that simply is not going to get you through a project, right? So it's how you make it more personal. So again, my recommendation is go back to whatever is true for you. How would you feel? Now think about that for a second. The other thing I want to point out is that something you said is true. It's like it becomes a question of identity and who am I? You know, I put that list of nuggets out there before, and one could say that all those boil down to who am I, right? But the specificity of who we are is what really makes the story, right? Every good story is a character discovering who they are, for better or worse, by the end. Right? We talk about emotional arcs and journeys and and, you know, too often it becomes this sort of Western Hollywood idea that like they start one way and then they're better by the end, right? But it doesn't have to be that way,
right?
Right? They just have to have a better sense of who they are in the end. That's what changes. It's not for they change for the better or the worse. They just have a better sense of who they are for the first time and how to move forward from there.
Right. And I think that I started that piece because I wanted to do the puzzle. I wanted to create this story where you're constantly guessing. I love reading books where you're constantly guessing what's happening. And then you read a couple more chapters and then all of a sudden it dawns on you that it could be completely coming from left field. And so I think that's why it stalled too. You're probably right, is because I'm not that invested. Whereas the second piece, I feel like is going to be a lot more gut wrenching and invested because it's a lot more personal, a lot more close to a personal exploration kind of. And I don't know if you want me to touch on the second piece, but basically, I don't know.
I'm going to say no, not because of you, but because I want to talk to Tony about Tony's project as well. But I'll say this, is that if I were you, I'd almost go after that first piece first, right? Often, to me, the stuff that's a little closer to the surface emotionally, on some level may give us that initial quick surge of energy to get stuff done, but can also get out of hand really quickly. And also, I don't know about you, but when I'm writing something deeply emotional, the risk is always I don't want to, it can become like quicksand.
Yeah.
Right? Like if it's too close to the surface, it can become like emotional quicksand and you're sucked into it. What I like about the first idea you have is that if you can figure out a way to take the trappings of this plot, this mystery, and have the personal thing in there, the plot is going to give you this sort of scaffolding to climb out of the quicksand if you need to, right? But you can work through the emotional stuff as you go. That's something I like in Matthias's piece, is that I can see big budget feature with with the energy and the action and the killings and all that stuff. That's wonderful because you have this to sort of protect yourself. But if he can really figure out Chris and Alex at their cores, there's going to be this wonderful humming emotional piece to it too. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, it's like when I meet people who want to tell, I'm going to write my memoir, it's the first thing I'm ever going to do, or write my autobiography, is whoa, you know what? Maybe just write a small, simple story first around it, right? Don't bite off too much because it can become overwhelming pretty quickly.
For sure, for sure. I feel like I also got muddled a little bit because I started getting into all these other characters that are surrounding this woman. Why did the sister take her in as her own child? Why, how has her husband, or now the dad, or who she thinks is the dad, has taken to this whole story? And you have this whole backstory of them trying to get pregnant multiple times, losing babies, so on and so forth. And now this child sister basically is pregnant. And so she's giving them the baby, so to speak, and they're very attached to her, but they're not their biological child. And the mom is still dealing with all the losses. And so, right. And then she's very close to her aunt. And it's just I think I'm all still all knotted up in there.
Just go back to the woman at the core of the story first.
Yeah.
The fact that I left that, not a pitch per se, but that synopsis, feeling like I understood 17 other characters better than I did the lead, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a key.
Yeah.
But we'll come back as things hit me. But Tony, I'm curious what your follow-up to Peekaboom is. It's a tough act to follow. It's a tough act to follow.
Yeah, this is true. Okay, so we're working on a project for kids. We're working on many projects, but this project we're working on the pitch right now. So I want to share the ideas. It's a series for kids. Mm-hmm. It's a commercial series. It's called The Adventures of Pallas. The name is Pallas, a private detective. So Pallas is a dyslexic, falafel-loving private detective, and he gets calls to resolve mysteries that at first are silly, but they turn out to be huge mysteries. So this is the idea of the series. Pallas has two people that help him, 2 private detectives that help him also. Taj, who is a 14 years old girl who is a hacker, ethical hacker, and Versailles, who is a pilot that drives a helicopter. And this team, Palace, Versailles, and Taj, they go on each episode to solve a new mystery. The series is not serialized, like there's no big story that moves from one episode to another. On each episode, we discover a new adventure, a new mystery to solve, and there's a structure for each episode. So this is what I'm sharing right now. I don't know if you need to know more. I can share more.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good start. And how do you spell the detective's name again?
Yeah, it's Palace. It's I'm gonna write it in the.
Okay. In the chat.
Yes. So it
okay.
sounds like a palace, but
right.
Yeah.
So that works. So, Chad, what do you think I'm going to say to Tony? Chad's figuring out the mute button. Matthias, oh, there we go. Good.
Just about the emotion at the center of the story.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's so funny because when you said dyslexic detective, I was already like, oh, that tickles my brain a little bit. How does this come into play? I want to hear something more about that. And then it sort of went away, right? So I'm curious about, like, you announced it and then it didn't go anywhere. What's that?
Yeah. So okay. It's because he's dyslexic, he couldn't go into the police academy because he failed the exam. Mm-hmm. But it turned out that this problem is not a problem because it helps him in the episodes. In each episode, somehow, because he's dyslexic, this features helps him to solve the mystery. So it turned out to be like something nice that happens then.
Okay. There we go. So that actually that tickles something, right? So he has. Once again, who's the audience for this? What age is the audience for this?
5 to 8.
Oh, okay. So this is a wonderful thing, and Steve, Mr. Chocolate Cake and Ice Cream, probably has some opinion on this too. But this is a nice thing, right? It's this idea of somebody who has a challenge that they actually get to use to their advantage every week, right? So your weakness becomes your strength. So I guess it's easy enough, and maybe with that age, it can be a little more straightforward that way, but it's sort of like Steve's piece. It's like, how do you make that fresh every time, right? I appreciate that it's episodic rather than serialized. That makes sense that they can stand alone. I think that makes sense. But how are you going to make that, how's that going to feel different every single time?
Well, to answer this, probably it's not going to be featured in every episode. It's going to be featured like every now and then. Okay. But when it's featured, it's like, it will make sense. For example, I'm going to give you one example. One of the first episode, actually, they're trying to resolve a code to a password, actually. And they have the letters written down, but they don't know what is the word from the password. So him just by looking at the word, at the letters, he knows what the word is, because his brain is trained to come up with words from letters that are misplaced. So this is how it is used at the first episode. We didn't think of the other episodes, but we know, like, this is a feature that is going to be used every now and then, like not at every episode.
So my temptation then is to take every character in the piece and give them their own challenge, right? Like the hacker has their own challenge, like every single character has something, so that they can sort of rotate through. But what's interesting would be to see how each person deals with it, right? Like so I would be doing some emotional work in terms of everybody has their burden here. Everybody has some hurdle that they've deal with. Chad had a rat tail when he was younger. Matthias has to deal with Austrians right now. We all have our challenges that we have to face, right? But some people handle it better than others, right? And some people don't handle it as gracefully than others. And so I'd start to look at how can I distinguish each of these characters so that they have a hurdle, and what it is that, not just like, oh, he can use his dyslexia to unscramble things better because he's been trained to do that, but also what's at play for him emotionally that he sort of gets over in the process of doing it.
Emotionally.
Yeah.
He's trying to prove to himself and to the world that he's a good detective. And it happens that all the cases that he receives are from kids that they call him, and it started with a very like a silly case. For example, someone calls him and they ask him to come, and he comes very quickly, and the kid tells him, "I lost my hamster." And he was like, "Really, you're calling me for this?" And they start to investigate, and directly it is linked to a bigger mystery, and it happens that he solves the big mystery every time. But it starts at a very simple problem every time. So he tries to, his problem, he wants to prove to the world and to himself that he's a good detective. This is like the backstory, because he was rejected to be accepted at the police school.
Okay. So I'll say this is right. Like the funny thing about the show is, once again, I hear a lot of promise in the show. Like I sort of want to regress and watch the show myself. So I'm in. I think the challenge is that the pretty quickly he will have proven after a few episodes, yeah, he's pretty good. He's a pretty good detective. And you go like, you knucklehead, you just proved it in the past 6 episodes. You're a good detective. You got it. But one of the reasons why I like these, the idea of these nuggets and stuff, and why I go back to them, is that here's the thing about a nugget, especially if you find one that you relate to as well as a writer, and not just the character, is that the only person's opinion that matters with a nugget is that person's opinion, not the rest of the world. So I do a lot of work teaching story to combat vets dealing with PTSD. I do a lot of work with the incarcerated and ex-offenders, teaching them storytelling to deal with their lives as well. And I can go either way. For ex-offenders, I could ask them the question, "Am I good?" Right? And you can practically see the gears grinding in their head and smoke coming out, because there's this friction created by the fact that even if they're surrounded by friends and loved ones who tell them they are good, and even if they want to be good, so much of society tells them they're not, that they can't make it work for themselves, right? To go to the vets, I was working for a couple of years with active duty members of special forces that most civilians would go are very brave. We won't get into the politics of warfare and military, that's another thing. But most civilians would go, oh my God, they're so brave and they've done amazing things, right? I would say that in working with them, 85% of the women and men I met in special forces asked themselves the question, am I brave?
Okay.
And it had nothing to do with their service. It had nothing to do with what they'd seen in combat. It had things to do like their bravery as a parent, their bravery as a person in a relationship, their bravery in facing life after service, which is really interesting. So if you get to these underlying questions for a character, Pallas could prove that he's a great detective to the world over and over again. But if you can find this thing that he can't satisfy, that's going to give you the energy to drive all the episodes. It could get to the point like Palace has, after 25 episodes, he solved a bunch of crimes, and now he's going to be awarded by the state somehow. Like, here's your medallion, and here's your statue, or something like that. And the amazing thing is, if he still has the question, he can still feel that emptiness inside, right? I don't wish it on anybody, but I'm sure everybody's experienced that at some point in their life, that feeling when you've gotten enough validation from the world around, or seemingly enough validation from the world around you, and still felt an emptiness of sorts. So if you can identify that emptiness for yourself, which probably in turn should be for your character, then you've got the thing that you need to drive the project. Excellent. Especially a series like that.
Okay.
And then makes me really curious about, like, what is it? What is it that Palace would question about himself?
Sorry, can you repeat? Because
it's like, I'd be curious what it is that Palace doubts about himself, no matter what he accomplishes.
I have a few ideas now, but I'll think more about this. One of the ideas I have now, because I've seen this like very closely to me, is maybe he needs the approval of his parents, because his parents do not give him the, like, for his dad, for example, or for his mom, like he's always gonna be the loser, for example. Even if he's a brave and successful detective, for his parents, he's always a loser, and this gives him like motivation to prove himself even more each time. And each time, maybe he passes the news to his parents, and they're not impressed. And like, yeah. So this is the first idea that came to my head. But
that's painful, not only because I relate, but but it actually it sounds very spot on to me, right? That sounds real, right? Because this already gives you the conflict of the show, is that the character at his core is trying to prove the wrong question. Like, he's solving the wrong question. He's solving these mysteries, and he solves each of them to prove that he's a good detective. But what he's really trying to solve is whether or not he's loved.
Yes.
Right.
Excellent.
And so, like, all his efforts are to do this one thing, and does it really well. But he's missing the point. Like, that's not the thing that's not the mystery you should solve. The mystery you should solve is, why don't you feel loved by those individuals, or why don't you feel loved naturally just at your core? And if you have some personal connection to it, all the more power to you. That's going to work.
Well, and you mentioned the dyslexia, and I think, I mean, there's so many ways you could go with that, right, too.
Yeah. To me, this actually, it seems really promising, Tony, because I feel like there are a lot of elements in there that I can see working in the show. And if you get that little underlying emotional mystery that he cannot solve, and that's actually the way I would think about it. It's like, here's a dyslexic detective who can solve just about any case in the world, but still can't figure out why he doesn't feel good about himself.
Oh, okay. Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was great.
No problem. I want to see all these things. The last thing I'll say about this idea of like these nuggets or these questions that the characters have is, as filmmakers and writers, I'm sure everybody here has had a moment where, like, either your film got into the festival you wanted it to, or you got the award that you wanted to, or you got the grant that you wanted to, and that was a thing that you had focused so much energy on. And then you get there and it happens, and then you go right back to that sort of empty feeling afterwards. Does anybody know that sensation?
Yes, of course.
Right. As a German, you just feel that naturally, existentially at all times. I realize that, Matthias, for the rest of us.
I think this is a topic of one, this was the motivation of one of the movies done by Pixar lately, about the musician that dies. Let me remember the name of it.
Soul.
Soul, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I read that the director, he had won many Oscars, or maybe one Oscar, and he felt empty. So it made him think, what is the purpose of life? And this is how he wrote Soul.
And so it seems like most people have seen Soul. Is that true?
Yeah.
I did. Yeah.
So there was a movie that I thought was, and it's a great way to sort of like wrap a conversation about story. There's a movie that I thought was great 98% of the way through, and then undercut its message at the very end. Right? The whole idea was that he was going to find some value in his life simply for being what it is, without the reward, without the return. And then they undo it. And that, so like the last 2 minutes of that movie make me crazy, because it doesn't feel in keeping with what they're actually trying to communicate. But that's me. Anyway, but we loved it here in the States. So
well, probably the sales team pitched that ending.
I have no doubt that absolutely you can't do that to the kids. Absolutely. Well, I have Chad, and Ilyan, I have your contact info. If anybody wants, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. If anybody wants to reach out with any questions or follow up, please do. I'm fascinated by these pieces and want to hear more. I can't stress enough how Chad, you already know that I'm a fan of Rat Tail, the movie, not the hair choice. And Best Orchestra in the World is the best sock movie I've ever seen. But also just really, really smart. Really smart, and I love the lengths that story goes to get its point across. I thought it was a really sharp satire as well. Michelle was gone because she doesn't like it. Ilyan, thank you so much for sharing your stories. Try to get over that hurdle. Just keep it personal, and don't go into the other characters before you know your focal character best of all. Steve, thank you. Chocolate Cake and Ice Cream is completely charming, and you just have to find that bitter undernote to make sure it doesn't get too saccharinely sweet as a series. And Tony, really thank you for your film Peekaboom, which I thought really was just sort of to watch an animated movie come across as a gut punch is a rare thing. So it was one that really took me by surprise, played with my expectations, and took on something that people didn't pay nearly enough attention to, and made it personal, which is really what you want to do as a storyteller. So
thank you so much. This means a lot. This means a lot.
So thank you all, and thank you Morgan and Bend Film Festival. Hopefully we can all meet in Bend next year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Warren.
Great.
Yep.
Great time.
Thank you, Warren.
Thank you.
Thanks, Warren.